3 seconds, Barry.
This man stands up.
Okay, Barry, and ready, Barry? 5, 4.
Okay, well, good morning, friends. I'm Barry Klein with the Houston Property Rights Association. Glad to see you're all here today. Let me tell you a bit about the Houston Property Rights Association. This is our 21st year in operation. Actually, I think it's the 22nd year in operation. We launched ourselves in 1992 to bring an election on a plan to impose zoning on Houston. We were successful with that. Kicked off a petition drive in November of 92, turned in our signatures in late August 93. It led to an election in January 94 that amended the Houston Charter so that in the future there always has to be a citywide referendum on any citywide zoning proposal for Houston. And that concept was actually embraced by citizens in Alvin, Texas, and in Rosenberg, Texas, and within the next 2 or 3 years through the mid-90s. So at that time, we adopted the practice of meeting weekly, and we still do that about 40 times a year. And we typically focus on local issues, though that's not exclusive. And I think over time, we've had probably half the decision makers in the Houston area have been at our microphone, and 1 or 2 have actually gone to jail in the years since we started. But we don't talk much about that. Well, we're gonna have a very exciting presentation today because we have Dave Welch with us. Dave has agreed to fill in. We had an emergency. Our speaker we had scheduled had to postpone. Should be here next week to talk about what she thinks should be happening with the city's for-hire taxi and transit industry. But Dave Welch was agreeable and fortunately free to come in today. Dave is actually heading up a very high-profile project at the moment to amend the Houston Charter. This is a referendum he's doing to repeal an ordinance adopted by City Hall not too long ago that would bring about some significant changes for people in our bathroom habits out in the public settings outside of our homes. But who knows where that'll go in the future. It's just a first step to get into our homes. Let me walk you through the handouts that we have before you, which I think will help frame the conversation. Let me first take you to this recent editorial by the Houston Chronicle, published on the 16th. It talks about an alien referendum, and what's remarkable, there's many things remarkable about this editorial. They refer back to one of the founding fathers of the U.S. Constitution. We know that the Chronicle oftentimes ignores the Constitution, the position it takes, but sometimes it'll cherry pick and pick something from that era to make a point. And they're trying to make the point that submitting minority rights to majority rule is a bad idea. And the question is, who's the minority in this case, and when should the majority actually rule? What I find very unrealistic about what the Chronicle is saying here is that they're saying that instead of having occasional elections to repeal an ordinance, to create an ordinance, or to amend the Houston Charter, we can simply rely on a slate approach to politics, where if you're unhappy with the incumbents and what they're doing, you can advance a slate of challengers, replace all the council members, or certainly a majority, and then have your way with city policy. I don't think anybody here has any memory of that ever occurring. I recall it once was tried. It was called the straight slate. That's when we had an issue in the mid-'80s regarding the rights or the privileges of homosexuals, of gay people in the Houston legal structure. And that was rejected by the voters, and there was an attempt by the ones who were successful with that petition and that rebuttal to bring in more their people of their persuasion on the council, and they failed, I believe, miserably. If there was even one elected, I don't recall it, but certainly it was not a successful effort to change city council with a slate, I don't think it's really possible. It takes far more money and luck than one normally has. And so obviously the only way to bring about some kind of reform to Houston politics and some kind of accountability is what we have today in the law, which is repealing bad law through a referendum measure, amending the charter, or perhaps initiating a new ordinance. And we should be thankful to those men and women of 100 plus years ago who brought these reforms to Texas and much of America, and those were the populists of the late 19th century and early 20th. And because they did that, that was been in the law, and it regrettably has not been used by the grassroots in Texas very often, to my knowledge, though I've actually been personally engaged in several petition drives to amend charters, and so have several people here in the room. But it's still pretty much an unused policy option or tactical option that I hope to see used much more frequently in the near future. And this will give the grassroots, and I regard the grassroots as people spanning the political spectrum, left and right, and that militant center, working together to find ways to fix at least local government, where I think lots of possible coalitions and convergence can occur. And we may see that in the upcoming issue regarding the changes in Houston bathroom policies. So let's talk a bit more about this editorial. The Chronicle wrongly thinks that a slate approach to reform is workable. Is clearly not workable looking at history. They also go on to talk about another petition drive that was attempted last year called the Early to Rise Education Referendum. This is a very strange thing that popped up last year. Hold a second. Need a bit of moisture. Somehow there's apparently a piece of Texas law that's been removed from the books that we all can find access to, but somehow is still operative. And people who wanted to have universal pre-K, I guess we might call it, in Harris County, decided they would use this pretty much unknown local instrument of government called the Harris County Department of Education, which has an elected board, but most people don't know that. They wanted to use that to give it an additional tax so it could start to provide universal countywide pre-K to people in the county. This did not have the pre-clearance, as it were, the political pre-clearance from the county judge at Emmett, and it ran into resistance immediately. Other parts of the county establishment were not sympathetic. In the end, somehow it fell into the memory hole, did not show up on the ballot. I personally would like to know more about what happened there, and I've been trying to reach out to the organizers to ask them to come in and tell us what happened and what they plan to do. But it does seem to be a case where maybe the law gave the grassroots a way to do something with a policy change, and the establishment found a way to squash it. And even though I may not agree with what the advocates of Early to Rise had in mind, I think I'd like to see it on the ballot so we could have a citywide, countywide conversation about that. Moving on to another one of the items before you. I want to show you this picture. This one that has a picture of our speaker turning in the signatures on July 3rd. The date on this is July 4th, Independence Day. And this is Dave Welch bringing in boxes of his petitions. And that's what he's going to be talking about in a few minutes, the problems we're having since then with the way the city's going through the validation process. And these are very gratifying moments I've actually been in, at least one of these moments where you turn in your signatures. I guess I've done it twice. And it's really quite gratifying. You've done a lot of work to get there. You've worked with volunteers. You've raised money. You've validated your signatures as much as you can. You box them up. You alert the media. And you go down and you stand in front of the city secretary's office with your little speech. And you walk in and you put the boxes on the counter. And you ask the city secretary to sign a receipt letter. I may be doing that soon in a little city in Fort Bend County. I've been doing a petition drive-in with some Fort Bend activists to require an election on a proposed zoning law in the city of Richmond. So, what I find interesting is that there's been no discussion in all this conversation about the downside of this new law that the city has about the threat that women face when they're in a situation in which a man can walk into a woman's restroom. If he expresses himself to be a woman, now I'm not quite sure what that means. Our speaker may have a good idea. Does he say, I'm wearing pants and a tie, but actually I'm a woman? Does he say that before he walks in? Or does he have to wear a dress and a blouse to get in? I don't know how you do that. We have a hand raised over here. Okay.
I'm just asking, is this truly a law or is it a mere ordinance? I mean,
That's ordinance is a law. It's not a state law, but that's the word we use at the local, at the city level.
It's actually a legal requirement.
It is a law.
Misdemeanor offense to violate.
Was it just,
How do you violate it?
does Mayor Parker just unitarily on her own, install this law? Or
Well, no, she had the council behind her. There was controversial. I think she lacked 6 votes, but she had enough to get it through. What I find of concern, though, speaking as a man, thinking of myself as a fellow who uses the restroom a lot, and there's urinals there, and the men are lined up, and are women now going to be able to come in and observe us in the act of urination? The men have been left out of this conversation up to this point, and of course my sensitivities are very heightened in these matters. So we have the situation where men have to worry about being observed in the act of urination. Women have to worry about the person in the next stall. Is that actually a man looking for an opportunity to rape or murder her? All these things are brought to us by this terrible new law that the mayor has offered and actually got council to approve. And another downside to this, in my opinion, is that we get used to seeing people walking into our restrooms that we use who are of the opposite sex, or possibly are. That will tend to corrode the public respect for the public sensibilities. You might see more public urination in the highways and byways of Houston if this actually becomes law. So it's a very important proposal that conversation we're going to be having in the very near future, because I am confident that this petition will be validized. Pardon me? Well, I don't know. The French have what do they call those things? Pissoirs? Yeah. Well, we eat French fries. I guess we can tolerate a little more Frenchification. Louis.
1940s, 50s, maids, women maids, cleaning the floors and everything. We're in the male restrooms while nobody paid attention. It's all cultural. And we must remember that in the past, other kinds of people were treated very badly too. Like, for example, blind people in Europe in the 18th and the 17th century, they thought the calamity because of punishment by God, and they were treated very badly and avoided. They didn't want to see them, So it's all cultural.
Okay, well, I guess we're going to getting ready for another cultural change, possibly. Okay, moving on to the next handout before we get to our speaker. His important comments. The next one is a copy of the petition that they have circulated. And what you find here is the one-line version. They chose to have people just use one line on their petition. It's more than I like to use. It also doesn't leave room for a person to put in their email address and phone number, something you black out before you turn it in to City Hall, but it does give you a contact list afterwards. And that's what's being used in Richmond, and that's what they have used in San Antonio, which I'll talk about in a minute. At the bottom, though, you'll see part of the controversy. This is something that the city requires in the city. Is it in the charter, David, or is it simply an ordinance? It's in the charter that you have to have an affidavit that says, I am a registered voter in the city, I've signed this petition, et cetera, et cetera. I recall how much discomfort I had with this back in 1992 when we kicked off our petition drive. We decided not to use it. We decided the state law didn't require it. It was a nuisance. We would not use it. but I had concerns. I was only 99% sure that we were right. And we survived that. The city did not raise that challenge. It appears now that many, many cities have this proviso. It is an impediment. And I have one lawyer's letter saying that this is not necessary, that the state election code does not require this for either charter amendments or recall petitions or referendum petitions or initiatives. That's what this attorney says, and we'll hope. I hope he's right. I hope if there's any litigation, that proves to be the case, because that'll make it easier for us in the grassroots to do our petition drives in the future.
Barry, I have a question.
Yeah, Jimmy.
Even before this ordinance was passed, I don't think it was against the law for a woman to go into a men's bathroom or for men to go into a woman's bathroom. Sometimes women have a long line for their bathroom. They come on over to the men's bathroom.
I did it myself recently. It was an accident. I left quickly.
Anyway, so that has not been against the law already.
This man says it is.
What
It is
law is that?
It's against state law. Which covers facilities, so.
But it's a law we can change. We'll just get a slate and change the legislature, fix that problem. Moving on to the next hand, and we can bring that up during Dave's remarks and during the Q&A. Next item deals with events in San Antonio. Now, I think most people who have been coming to these meetings recognize or know that there's actually been 6 petition drives kicked off in Texas, mostly to amend charters. In fact, I guess all of them have been to amend charters, not even counting the one that Dave's going to talk about. And 2 have failed. They have did not have enough signatures, didn't have enough donors, and they have basically stopped gathering signatures. But 3 continue because one of them is now finished, and that's the one in San Antonio. They had to get, in a big city like Houston or San Antonio, you have to get 20,000 signatures or 5% of the registered voters, whichever is less. So 20,000 is the number you go for. And you have 180 days, roughly 6 months, to get it done. And that's what they managed to do in San Antonio. They kicked off their election, I think maybe during early voting, and turned them in early July. And turns out there's controversy in that city regarding it was a valid petition. They may end up in court. But in the meantime, it was such an impressive showing, and the fear of the elected officials to have to deal with this at the polls has driven them to officially drop the project. They've withdrawn the money that was allocated by the city and allocated by the county, and so that project is now dead. And the real advocates are hoping that they can avoid an election in November or May, because if it's postponed from November, it may end up in May. That's going to cause problems for politicians at the city or at either the county level or the city level, and I'll explain what I mean. The county, what's that fellow's name? The county judge, who I think is a former mayor of San Antonio, is a rail advocate, and he's up for re-election. He's got a challenger who's anti-rail. He doesn't want to see this issue on the ballot to bring out the anti-rail vote when he's on the ballot facing an anti-rail challenger. So he's desperate to keep it off the November ballot. If he's somehow successful, it might end up on the May ballot. That's when the city, in most parts of Texas, most city officials are elected in May, and all the pro-rail people don't want to see it on the May ballot. So they've got a very interesting political dilemma in San Antonio. Delightful for people like ourselves who are mostly anti-rail, which means we're pro-bus. We think buses are a smarter and cheaper option. So here you see a story showing a photo of the turn-in of the petitions. Again, a very gratifying moment for all the activists who worked on that. And you see the reporter explaining that this project has now been defunded by the City Hall in San Antonio. Very, very good news. Now, I've been alerted by a friend of mine who lives in Austin, where there's another pro-rail contingent, and they've got an election coming up on a light rail scheme that's divided the pro-rail community because it's not the one that they really want. It's another thing that the politicians preferred for one reason or another. But there's plans to try and link Austin and San Antonio with a commuter line. That way, all those transit-dependent people living in the in the hills of the Texas, in their $500,000 homes, can get a subsidized ride into a job site in Austin or San Antonio. So that's in the minds of the infrastructure lobby. But what's happening now in San Antonio, which will require an election on anything that might require use of city of San Antonio right away, kind of screws up that big plan. So the impact of what they've done in San Antonio may have an impact on what's happening in Austin. That's good news for us who feel ourselves normally the victims of the infrastructure lobby, who normally have their way in all these matters. Hold on. Moving on. Next item before you. Have a question?
While you were speaking of that clause about bathroom, I looked it up.
About what?
About the bathroom clause in the Houston City Council thing, not to
Yeah.
bring you back. There's reports that says that clause was removed before that bill was passed.
I'll address that.
Our speaker will address that. I think I know the answer too. Okay, the next one is really very, very interesting because this is a letter, an email sent to the city attorney in San Antonio by Letitia Vasic, who's the city clerk. I guess that's her name for the city secretary. And she raises some questions that have come up regarding the legality of the petition, and she asking for answers. Now, she also sent a request for a clarification on the law to the Secretary of State's office. I'll try and have that at a later meeting. But what we learned here in the third paragraph is that now modern technology makes it easier for a city to validate a petition. Right now, if it's a relatively small petition, they can go through and look at every one. If it was a large petition, 20,000 signatures or more, they can do a 1 in 4 sampling. And one hopes that will work out properly. Well, now with modern technology, apparently they can just run these things through a computer with a scanning system, I imagine, and get an accurate result. Though I guess you might go back and see if the readers are working properly. There might be some technical challenge there. But it does mean that they can do a validation in very short order. That means you may have more time than you imagine to turn your signatures in before that deadline. The deadline this year in Texas is for all that to be done, validated, put on the council agenda. That's like a 3-day run-up until the election, until the meeting of the council, to put it on the November ballot. And this year in Texas, it's August 18th. So that's the deadline I and my friends in Fort Bend are dealing with in Richmond. We may have our drop-off next week to make sure that city secretary has time to do that. It shouldn't be hard if you only have 300 signatures. But a bigger city, it's a bigger problem. Dennis?
Barry, are you saying that when the petitions are validated, that it still has to go to the council, be read, and voted on for it to go on the ballot?
Right, I think it's called the election order.
Would that be interesting to find that that's the only time that council doesn't use and declaring an emergency clause?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, right. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I guess it's their choice to use that very old feature in our law, I guess our charter.
Everything that's read,
Yeah.
and declaring an emergency so it doesn't have to be read 3 times.
Yeah. Well, that's because government got so big with so many responsibilities, they couldn't go through the ordinary small agenda they might have once had, where they actually didn't need to invoke the so-called emergency proviso for every council meeting. So, anyway, so that was good. That's the good news on the front page. There's also good news on the second page. At the top, you see what the city clerk has laid out. I think it looks like 16 categories of different kinds of problems, or simply categories she puts these petitions in. That shows you how complicated it can be for people doing the pre-validation. Before they turn them in, they have to think hard about which ones are valid. There's questions that come up regarding the petition, if you can read the signatures, if you can read the printed name, etc. So that's kind of a chance to see how complicated it can be to do a petition. And then we see in that second paragraph that in the city of San Antonio, in their city charter, there's a provision that says if you fail to get enough signatures on that first submittal, you can try again to supplement. I think that's a very good idea. Why should we have a process where if you fall short by 100 or 200 signatures, all of a sudden all your work is wasted? I'd like to see all of Texas reflect that. I think it's a very sensible thing. And why do it just once? It's not easy to get volunteers to come back in and get more signatures and do validating. I don't think there's a big risk. Just let people continue to, as long as they're all within 180 days, why not let those new supplemental submissions be accepted and validated? Hold on. I'm sorry?
Isn't that the same as referendum, Barry?
What?
We've got petition?
Well, a petition, I'm just saying, any kind of petition you submit, why is it that only the ones you turn in that first day time are the ones that will be counted, and any additional signatures will not be counted? Let the new signatures count if it turns out the first validation shows you fell short. Last year in Elgin, Texas, where they're trying to stop them from building a rail line from Austin to Elgin on the edge of Travis County, they assumed that they could turn in their signatures on Friday, knowing that they may not have enough, and turn in a few more on Monday after they worked the weekend getting more signatures. Well, they were wrong. They fell short, and the new signatures were not accepted. Show you something about the tools of the petitioner. This is what I carry when I'm out getting signatures, doing block walking. This is the form that we're using in Richmond. And you simply walk up to the door and you hope they're home and you hope they're open to the idea of letting the citizens vote on major policy questions. And my experience is we're getting about 5 signatures an hour. So it can be work, but it's doable in a small city. Let me talk a bit about Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader is a man can be found on YouTube with Ron Paul, because Ron Paul and Ralph Nader see that in some areas, maybe many areas of policy, that the left and right can link arm in arm and work for reform. I certainly believe that's true at the local level. So Ralph Nader has a new book out called Unstoppable. It talks about what he thinks is the unstoppable coming together of the reform elements in the left and right to find those areas of common cause. I personally think that the tendency of government to give tax dollars to developers and insider business interests is an obvious area where people can work together to stop that. I'm sure there's many other areas dealing with some aspects of civil rights that we could work together, and quite possibly something like a charter amendment setting up a sunset commission at the city level so all the city's rules and regulations on land use and on business could go through a periodic review every 3 or 5 years, so bad laws don't stay on the book until the political pressure gets so bad that they finally admit that it's time to change. So we put a little more method and I guess system to what is actually an ongoing practice of occasionally rewriting an ordinance, but do it systematically so it doesn't get so bad that the current law may not have as many victims as it would have otherwise. And on the national level, we have the Lucy Burns Institute up in Wisconsin, and they put out this booklet called Local Ballot Initiatives, doing research in all 50 states. 47 states make it possible to do some kind of local initiative, such as we're doing here in Texas. And so this is on the web. It's available for free, and I have given out many hundreds of this booklet. I think it's starting to have an impact in Texas. Okay, one more sip, and we'll get to our main speaker. Dave, I think I first met you when you first arrived in Houston, about 92, 93. I think you came down from the north. Dave Welch is the founder and executive director of the U.S. Pastor Council and Houston Area Pastor Council, the interdenominational and interracial ministries outlet for pastors based in Houston, Texas. Over the past 25 years, he has held numerous leadership positions, including founding executive director of the Christian Coalition of Washington, the national field director of the Christian Coalition, and the executive director of Vision America. Dave facilitated the launch of the Houston Area Pastor Council in 2003 and now involves over 200 pastors to develop a grassroots model showing how to build a team of pastors mutually committed to promoting biblical righteousness and justice in the home, the church, the community, and in our government. Affiliated councils have also been launched in other cities in Texas as part of the Developing Texas and U.S. Pastors Council. He has also been a weekly columnist for WorldNet Daily online news. Dave and his wife Valerie have been joyfully married for 31 years and live in Magnolia, Texas. He's been blessed with 6 children, ages 16 to 30, all homeschooled, as well as 3 amazing granddaughters and a wonderful grandson. So I give you Dave Welch. Thank you.
And of course, that last part of the bio is the only part that matters, right? Of course, we're up to, and we have another grandchild on the way, so we'll just tell our kids, keep them coming. Just to give you a quick overview, because there's a lot of confusion about the ordinance itself and what it entails, and I want to jump right to the question that came up earlier, because that's really the essence of the intended misinformation that the mayor and her allies have put out on this thing. And frankly, those of you who have studied dialectic politics and the Marxist left and Alinskyite type strategies, this was a stereotypical action of that. And if you think of it in terms of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, you can pick any kind of legislation you see, but when you go back to the political history, you can almost find in every case of a dramatic move of the left a huge step forward that takes the most radical extreme step. And then when the backlash occurs, they always take 1 step back, right? And we compromise, and everybody's happy, except that we lost 1 step, right? And so traditionally, that's the way it works. So this case, in this ordinance, now by the way, this goes back to San Antonio also, for those of you who followed that. The clause in the San Antonio ordinance that was so egregious that caught national attention right out of the gate was that the preamble opening clauses in that said that any person who had ever, in word or deed, expressed a bias against any of these protected classes would be unqualified to hold any city-appointed position. Did you hear what I said? So ever expressed in word or deed a bias. So if you'd ever express an opinion in any venue, in any setting against the new protected class of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and so forth, in particular, you are now persona non grata in city government. Now, they ostensibly claim when the outcry occurred on that particular clause, there was claim that they took that out. They, in fact, did not, because it was inserted a little further on into the ordinance anyway. It was a lesser version of that, but part of it is still there. In the same way in Houston, the clause there are 3 major sections of this ordinance dealing with housing, employment, and public accommodations. In public accommodations section, there was a subclause that specifically and in detail alliterated the use of restrooms and that businesses could not discriminate. But the fact of the matter is that clause had detail which basically gave protections to businesses because it gave some descriptions about what a business could use to identify whether a person's their perception or the behavior of that person, or they could use some standard of dress. In other words, if that person looks like a female going into the women's restroom or vice versa, and the behavior is, I can factor that in to say, no, that's the wrong restroom. I could stop that person. That clause was taken out. Now, let's just ask you a simple question. Public accommodation, as defined in the ordinance, means any place of business open to the public. Okay? Now, so that means we're in a public accommodation right now. If I walk through into there, that's a public accommodation. I walk into the restroom, it's a public accommodation. Okay? When I go in the front door or out until I'm back out the front door, this whole building is a public accommodation, right? So the restrooms are not excluded. So that clause simply gave additional detail and actually some protections for businesses of what they could do to keep men out of the women's restrooms. That clause, once gone, left it wide open. So now you don't have to look like a woman, dress like a woman, talk like a woman, or have anything of that nature to walk into the women's restrooms. That's just the way, because the gender expression, category of this thing, if you look in definitions in the ordinance, these new protected categories of sexual orientation and gender identity, which includes expression. So, and the expression of your gender, even if different from that at birth. Well, what does that mean? So, the whole framework of this, that part of the ordinance is very clear. Restrooms are still in, except it's worse. That the businesses, churches, whatever, eventually will have no standing to restrain anybody from keeping them out of the restrooms. Now, let me back up then, though, to address the bigger picture of this. First of all, this is a solution looking for a problem. It's just real simple. There were no claims of discrimination of any of these categories. The mayor, who's a pathological liar, and she just is, it's who she is. She wouldn't know the truth if it hit her like a freight train. And because, first of all, specifically, when she came out and announced this ordinance, she denied in the very first press conference that this was about the LGBT community, okay? And that there were those who would make it that way, and that simply was not true. That's her own exact words. Now, what we then forced later on the city to admit, and her to admit, was that the race, and by the way, they tried to make this about race, that there were some elements of racial discrimination, that blacks were being kept out of clubs on Washington Avenue. How many times did you hear that? Well, by the way, our organization is heavily minority. We have black pastors, Hispanic pastors who are very involved in civil rights issues. Many of them are civil rights era veterans. None of them were aware of any racial problems in that particular area, in that particular part of it. So now, that's not saying there's not racial discrimination or problems. The issue is here, why this ordinance and why now? And we raised that question repeatedly. And one incidence of discrimination does not an ordinance require, okay? There has to be sound basis for public policy. I mean, it's real simple. So if is there a pattern? Is there a wide-scale abuse of behaviors? Is there things that legitimize forcing every citizen in the city of Houston to comply with a new law if there's only one or two incidents, even if there were those incidents? They never could give us specifics, not once. Anecdotal, I believe, this could happen to me someday, I feel bad about this. So, first of all, we smoked out the truth, which is that there was no problem. Now, because the fact of the matter is, last September, after San Antonio's ordinance was passed over great opposition in the city, Mayor Parker, of course, publicly announced her support for that ordinance. Those of you who remember her inauguration speech this time, again, also said, what did she say? It's time. She announced her intent to promote this ordinance. We know that the Human Rights Campaign, the national LGBT advocacy group on the national level, was on the ground in San Antonio for 6 months prior to the passage of their ordinance. We also know that Denise Parker is part of their national leadership team, and they're in regular communication here. This is part of a national agenda. This had nothing to do with a local problem. So I want to emphasize that, because wherever you're at on the issue, and there's a lot of differences or perspectives of disagreement on some elements of obviously philosophy and so forth, but at some point in time, if you're going to lie, then frankly, the reality is you just don't have, obviously, a credible basis for the policy. Just tell the truth. And she never has in this whole process. So when we finally, brought to the council and put it out on the table that, A, why are you imposing this on business? For example, we know we have cases, and we work with a national legal advocacy group called Alliance Defending Freedom, who have documented dozens of cases, and these are just specific cases that have actually reached the courts all over America, where businesses have been criminalized. Business owners have literally losing their businesses for simply declining to do business with somebody in violation of their conscience. And there's no conscience protection clause in this. So, for example, in Texas, it's not, at this point in time, even with the judge's decision, which has been stayed, marriage is still between a man and a woman. If somebody walked into my florist shop said, I want you to do flowers for a same-sex blessing ceremony, which they can do. It's not an official marriage. And I simply said, well, and by the way, this is an exact case from Richmond, Richmond, Washington, where a lady, a florist who'd had a customer for 9 years, served them faithfully, great relationship, regular business, came to the point once same-sex marriage was legalized in the state, approached her about doing their ceremony. And she declined, just said, I'm happy to do other things for you, but my faith and my conscience is such that I can't participate in that ceremony because it's a violation of what I believe. But there are florists all over the town, you're welcome to go with somebody else, which they did. And then they filed a complaint to the state attorney general, who is now investigating and shutting down that business and charging them with a crime because she simply did not believe though. So this is a matter of whatever you believe, and you're willing to let others be punished for their beliefs. I don't care what you believe, you're next. So this was now the ordinance going to be passed in the city of Houston. That is a business, if you decline, if you discriminate in any way in these categories as a photographer, it doesn't matter. The service businesses were greatest at risk. But private property is at stake here as well. When you look at the whole framework of this ordinance, it's another major encroachment of business telling people that you must do this with your property or you will be a criminal. And so the question is, what's the compelling government interest for doing this for one specific category of people? Nobody argued the need for protections based on race, religion, sex, disability, legitimate categories that historically have been given protected class. The other specific term used in this ordinance that's new, because they have to continually invent things, is characteristic. It's a protected characteristic. That's a good question. What does that mean? Now, everybody in this room has different characteristics. What do you define as a characteristic? If you recall, in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and jurisprudence since that time, they granted protections to classes, right? The class standing was, in order to qualify as a protected class, what they used to call suspect class, you had to meet 4 criteria as a class. Number 1, you had to have an immutable, identifiable quality. In other words, I can see it, I can tell it, we can measure it. Skin color, for example, pretty easily. You had to have, as a class, been historically denied access to education, economically disadvantaged, and so there's one more, which I'm forgetting at the moment. But again, those were typically the standards held to reach that class status and protections. So all of a sudden, the courts themselves have kind of moved toward obliterating that. And this is the bigger issue problem we face. But for the moment, the question was, how do you define it? And let me just give you another example where this is going. Baton Rouge, this last week, delayed their vote on a similar ordinance as Houston. It has very similar language, slightly different. But the definition of gender identity was your inner sense of gender. Okay, so I can't discriminate against you based on your inner sense of gender. Does that make any sense to anybody? Okay, how do you define that? And my inner sense today may be different than what it is tomorrow. In this law in Houston today, I don't have to have biologically changed one thing to qualify as a woman. Did you know that? So the fact of the matter is that the standards on this thing, and I challenged, one of the transgender activists asked me on public access television last week, well, what restroom am I supposed to use? And I said, well, what are your genitalia? And they went all sorts of upside down and said, well, that's none of your business. I said, no, you made it my business. You're the one that brought this into public policy debate. So the fact is, that's the only thing that matters to me about whether you should use my wife's restroom, is if you were born a male, then you don't use the men's restroom. But we now live in a culture where we have become so confused, and we've rejected the historical design and order of creation of male and female, and God's creation of male and female, and biological proof and scientific evidence of the differences, that we're now going to obliterate that and say you can be whatever you want to be. And we're going to enshrine that in public policy and create criminals who don't agree. That's the essence of this ordinance. That's why we're fighting it. That's why we're going to take it all the way to the mat. We've got a dishonest mayor, a dishonest city attorney who we know are using every means they can to try to disqualify this petition. We'll take them to court, we'll sue, we'll make them defend every signature, every petition, and we will frankly shine the light on the dishonesty and the corruption behind this process, but we will not relinquish the rights and the safety, the protections of the citizens of the city. So I thank this group in particular. You guys have been on point on this forever, and I just want to thank you for all that you do along the same lines. It's all part of the same battle fundamentally.
We're not all exactly the same.
We don't all agree on everything, of course, no, and I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that the battle for freedom ultimately, and this is what this is too, ultimately converges around some core simple principles. So, yes, sir.
Since,
You got time to take a question, Bear?
since determination of gender apparently has nothing to do with genitalia, wouldn't it then be correct to outlaw declared lesbians access to a women's restroom?
Well, you'd be surprised to know we actually had lesbians sign this petition because for the same reason. They didn't want men in their restrooms either. Okay, so the issue is I actually proposed to the lieutenant governor before the beginning of last session. They all thought I was kidding. Now they don't. They're not laughing anymore. I said we need a state law that defines, for statutory purposes, gender in the state of Texas. What is it? Is it what you're born with, which is the historical standard of your birth, of your gender as identified, not defined at birth, but as identified based on, typically there's the only precedence in the state of Texas right now that the courts can use is a previous court case, state civil court case, that gave three specific things. Your gender at birth defined by your genitalia, your organs, and your chromosomes. And that says what you are at birth. So now, whatever variation of that, that's what it should be, and it should stay that. So, and this is different than sexual orientation or behavior even. That's a whole other debate. Yes, sir.
God's, as you interpret God's order of creation to justify your act. Do you place, if you feel the Bible conflicts with the Constitution, what do you obey, the Bible or the Constitution?
I don't believe the Bible does conflict with the Constitution, so that's a red herring. Yes, sir.
Also, in
Give me specifics, and I'll answer the specific question.
the
Yes, sir.
determination of gender, back to that point, since we can do transgender gender modification, would that not then wipe out the immutable characteristic for discrimination based on sex? I mean, can't we just wipe that out so there's no more women-based businesses?
Well, again, here's the thing. The current standard of discrimination protection is the term is sex. Okay, on your applications on the census data, it's called what's your sex, male or female, right? So the term gender is actually a different term that's been used to try to start moving away from an absolute standard. Nobody argued. And again, this again, the fact of the matter is, a reasonable person, and then as we know, in standing of law, at some point in time, it comes down to what would a reasonable person do. So historically, there's never been a serious argument about the difference between male and female. That's where we're at now. So the fact is, obviously, there's some people who believe it can be whatever you want it to be, and there are those of us who believe that it's who you were made, who you were designed, and how you were born. And that's the way the debate's going to have to bear out. That's our position. It may not be yours, but frankly, I think our position of definitive, definable scientific evidence and data and history are pretty solid. So, Barry.
Steve, I think there may be more ambiguity in this question of male and female than you're aware of yet. I recall a very impressive book I read, partially, in college. It was a higher level book read by people who were in the medical profession, about the Klinefelter syndrome, about people who were born with a confusing genitalia, where doctors will have to guess. And a person is brought up as a male or a female. Later on, confusion develops because they actually feel more male than their genitalia indicates, and vice versa. So you do have those areas of confusion.
Okay, well, let me answer that question specifically, okay, because first of all, that accounts for less than 1/10 of 1% of the population, less than 1/10. And we don't even know how much less than 1/10. The entire transgender community in total, nationwide, which means it's probably less than this, but the census data can determine, is 0.3% of the population. So are you telling me that there's an aberration in 0.5% of the population, or as high as 0.3% of the population, or 0.05, I should say, or up to 0.3%. The 99.7% of the population is supposed to alter our beliefs, our freedoms, and our lifestyle to cater and to alter fundamental constitutional freedoms. That's not minority majority. That's tyranny of a tiny fragment. Yes.
I agree with you, and I think we can, at this point, do a thought experiment on what the remedies might be, a governmental answer and a non-governmental answer. The governmental answer would be to require more of the family bathrooms in public facilities. So if you can go into a restroom that has it's not male or female, you lock that door, you're in there by yourself. That's one answer. And then the private sector answer is that could happen voluntarily by merchants who think I want to be open to all my possible customers.
Right. And there are many facilities, obviously, that do have family restrooms that are single-use restrooms, obviously the big issue is the multiple stall, restrooms in public use, but here's again, I've learned a long time ago. I grew up out in the woods. I'm not the brightest guy, but I figured whenever I find a camel's nose, there's always a camel on the other end. Okay, and so if the camel's nose in the tent, and it doesn't matter what area of public policy you can look at, whether it's property rights, whether it's Second Amendment rights, whether it's First Amendment rights, we don't lose them in great leaps, right? We lose them in increments. And this increment began and has continued over the course of the last 30 years. And here's the issue. Because the other side claims victim status, which is frankly simply not true in any capacity. Everybody gets picked on. I mean, redheads get picked on. Short guys get picked on. That's my problem, okay? There are always issues of behavior that isn't acceptable in a society. Look at our kids today. We talk about bullying. We talk about all sorts of other issues. The question is, at some point in time, the Constitution guarantees fundamental freedoms within certain limitations to keep government out of encroaching upon the right of the citizen to live out within the framework that we don't interfere with others' rights, right? We have slowly, systematically been hedged into those areas of freedom, and right now the freedom of conscience is under the greatest threat it has ever been, because this is about, we are not allowed to disagree. We're not allowed to speak, or as you heard in San Antonio, to think or speak in word or deed in a contrary way to this protected class. So that means I can no longer believe what I want. That's the essence of the LGBT agenda. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, they want to silence their opposition. Now that's not a movement that's consistent with the United States Constitution, with our founding principles. So that's another big issue at stake here, the freedom under threat. Yes, ma'am.
If the standard of gender is how you think you are at the moment, what is that going to do to all these advantages that women get if they want to contract with the city or the state and non-discrimination? Is that going to throw them off? How do you feel like you are at the moment, sir? Well, I feel like I'm a woman. But by the way, having had little children, I don't know anybody that lets their young children go into a restroom by themselves, whether it's at Memorial Park or the airport, anywhere, because certain people are looking for access to children, and you can't let them go in to a restroom by themselves.
Well, and
Are
that's
these
generally
people
true.
just after access?
Well, first of all, yeah, those are legitimate issues, okay? And unfortunately, it points to the fact that we live in a society that's morally come unglued. We didn't live like that when we were kids, right? No, I doubt if anybody in this room lived in a society where we couldn't walk 2 miles down to the park or disappear into the woods like I did, or walk down the road for miles and spend all day outside of my mom's sight. We live in a different world that we live today. We do. But why? What's the why? The why is because we have lost our morals. We've lost the framework of protection of innocence and a lot of other type of those things. This is a move away from that, not toward that. So the issue is, no, that may be the case, but what about my wife? Okay, forget the kids.
Yeah.
Okay? If my wife walks into a restroom and a big 6'2" ugly guy walks right in behind her, I got a problem with that. Now, he may claim to be a woman, but I'm going to drag him by his shirt collar back out, and I'll go to jail. But the question is, why should I have to live, and why should you have to live? Why should we have to expose our wives and our daughters and our children to a society in which we can't define certain things that protect them? I won't live in a city that way. And so we have to ask ourselves these questions, and we can't cater to tiny fragments that are morally confused in order to compromise our own freedoms. Yes, sir. Jimmy, I'm sorry, I'll get to you next.
You were talking about the, one thing popped up, some woman has been arrested because her 9-year-old boy walked a mile or something.
I saw that story
in the
too,
city
yeah.
park. I haven't found the guts of the story yet. But the problem, the thing for me is, I just can't, I'm just so tired of all these little thingies like this popping up. But the problem, one of the problems running for me is that you can end up as a member of one of these little groups, and it depends on what the group is, but I'm looking at just, you know, the Christians versus Muslims in some places. I just soon make restroom for the purpose of eliminating fluids and put a lot of stalls in, and that's it. Just drop the whole male-female thing, aren't we?
Well, again, that's a debate we can have, but that's not the culture in which we live, and it's, again, so the question is about, again, is that what, I mean, that's why our position right now is very simply, which the mayor is scared, mayor and her people are terrified to let this get to the ballot. My question is why? We're not, let the people vote. And the truth of the matter is, if the majority of the citizens of Houston want the restrooms open, we want this ordinance, well then it's going to pass. I don't think they're going to let it get to the ballot because they frankly don't think that's the case. Jimmy?
Yeah, this equal rights ordinance is basically about equal rights in housing, employment, public accommodations. We want equal rights for gays to be able to rent a house, have a job, use public accommodation. We don't want people to say, well, you can't live in this house or rent my house because you're gay. That's what it's all about. This stuff we're going in restrooms, that's just smoke screen or a red herring. That's not really going to happen. So
Oh, yes,
why
it does.
Why are you
Yeah.
against gays?
Well, we've been very clear what we believe. First of all, I do not believe that sexual orientation, any kind of behavior, I don't care what it is, qualifies as a legitimate protected class equal to race. I don't accept that premise. It doesn't fly.
Gays should have equal rights.
Do you believe a behavior should have equal legal status with race?
It's not behavior, it's about who they-
Answer the
about
question,
who they
Jimmy.
are.
Answer the question.
It's about who they are.
Answer the question.
I think that gays should have the same rights to marry, to have a job.
So you won't answer the question. So the point is that sexual behavior, now, because nobody's ever proven, by the way, they've never yet proven any documentation, any scientific study, that there is a biological proclivity toward homosexuality. Now, nobody I know, including anybody in the Christian, the clerical community, believes that anybody should be mistreated. That's just wrong. But we're not talking about behavior or personal interaction. We're talking about public policy here. And what they are after is forced moral acceptance, not equal rights. There's no such thing as equal rights in this category. It's unequal rights. This is taking the rights of a group based on its behavior and its gender confusion and putting theirs superior to the rights of those who are not. And that's not good public policy.
It's bringing them up to equal rights.
No, it's not.
Already have.
It's really not at all. Yes, sir.
John?
Yeah, I would just like to say I appreciate your arguments. I think they're mostly objective and very factual. A lot of the campaign against this ordinance has been framed in as the Sexual Predator Protection Act, which I think is disingenuous and sort of, you haven't used that word one time or that phrase once in your presentation. And I think if we really do have an opportunity to sort of overturn this ordinance, we come at it with a factual context and not such a scaremonger. You know, it's not a Sexual Predator Protection Act because if somebody goes into the opposite bathroom and commits any sort of assault, battery, rape, they're not protected by the law. They're still going to be criminally charged for those actions. So I think when you use fear-mongering terms like that, a lot of people, especially younger people, will sort of just turn off and stop listening. But when you present a case very factually and objectively, the arguments can be accepted much more easily.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree in general on that, and we are arguing facts. And this, we've put data, we put studies, we put legal cases by the dozens in front of the city council to defend in our position on this all the way through. They've never put any empirical evidence on their side whatsoever, and that's what's troubling about this. And the final act of taking intentional abuse of authority to disqualify signatures of the city that were duly presented to this, which is what we think is probably going to happen. We're going to go to court to keep the people silent and not allow the people to vote on this, frankly, shows that they don't have a credible position. So I think fundamentally, if their position is sound and valid, they should back up, say, let the people vote. The city council should have done that to start with, and it would have avoided this whole thing. But that's our call to them. Have the confidence in your position. Let the people vote. We won't be happy if we lose any more than anybody else will be, but that will be the voice of the people spoken, and then we'll move on to the next issue. There are more important issues in this city than this.
Dave, when Kathy Whitmire was mayor and she finished her last term, she left town. She took a job with a national foundation. Do you think that Mayor Parker is trying to feather her nest for a future job?
I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, we know what Mayor Parker has national political aspirations. She was the head of Mayors for Freedom to Marry. She's been outspoken on that issue. She has obviously made this her centerpiece of her campaign, so I don't think there's any doubt this is part of that. So let me say.
Let me take a question from Dale and then Steve.
I'd like to go back to the resolutions. I've been hurt by the mayor on resolutions. I filed for mayor last year with 900 petitions, only needed 528, and she says mine were not valid because they were done collected 3 or 4 years before. The state ethics office says they were valid, and they do not valid. And I went to the law court, and they didn't do anything for me. And I'm considering continuing on my case. I'd like your advice in that.
Well, I'm not an attorney, but I'll tell you this. This mayor has acted outside the law on a variety of things. She has displayed the same disregard for the rule of law as her hero, Obama. We see the same thing coming out of that administration as we do this one. And everybody knows, even her own allies admit that she is known as being vindictive, being retaliatory. That's not the kind of governments we want. And we can, Bill White, I didn't agree with Bill White on a lot of things, but I never saw Bill White act dishonorably. Okay, nobody has his personal integrity. And you can disagree with policies and things, but this mayor is somebody who has proven herself to think of herself above the law. And unfortunately, the voters of Houston just didn't care enough not to re-elect her 3 times. So that's our bad, right? So the truth of the matter is when only 14% of the people vote, when only 18% of the people vote, but at the end of the day, the big picture for us, and I'll throw this book out, when the 86% decide they care enough to participate, we'll probably get better government. But that's part of our bigger picture challenge here and all that. So.
A couple of comments. I agree with your nose under the tent analogy. I think it's very apt in this situation. In general, the movement of society. And I'd just like to point out that there's another group where the analogy also holds. And that's when people unwittingly, unknowingly sometimes, get dealings with the mob.
The mob?
Say yes. If you're in trouble and you want to get a loan and you can't find it at the bank, maybe you get a loan from a fellow there. He tells you, okay, don't worry about it. The next thing you know, you got the mob on your back. Same kind of thing. Now the other thing is, in this instance and on a number of these social issues that have been going on for some time now, it's the failure of the policymakers and the public to understand the difference between anti-discrimination and special privileges. There's a big difference, but we don't seem to recognize it.
I've got a question. We lost Steve Bruce Otsey, who has headed up the campaign for the revenue cap, the tabor, the measure that limits the city's ability to collect revenue unless it gets voter approval on any surplus above a certain formula. And this was something that this organization worked on in 2001 when we did the petition drive. It was finally voted on in 2004, approved by the voters. but never properly implemented by the city. And now the mayor and council are bumping up against the restrictions in this. The language itself is still in litigation, actually, whether it's going to officially show up in the charter or not. But they're dealing with it. In fact, Mayor White had his own version of this idea, and it certainly that is recognized by the city as in the charter. So the city's trying to decide whether to ask the voters to overturn that charter amendment and whether to put that on the ballot. And should they put it on the ballot in November or in May? Now, it's in May that's the month before they have to adopt the new budget for 2016, I guess, at that point. And so they've got this revenue fiscal problem they're facing, tied up with a political question, tied up with what you're doing with this, well, yours is not a charter amendment, so actually would not affect that. But it all has some impact on who shows up at the polls to do what on election.
And that's, of course, is part of one of the questions, because the charter amendment stipulates that if the petition, the referendum petition, is declared qualified, it would go on the next city general election ballot, which could be interpreted to be next year, or they can call a special election, which they can put it on this year's ballot. The mayor's already indicated that if it were qualified, that she would put an election order to put it on this year's ballot, which we agree with. Looks like this is an issue. She declared it an emergency. Let's just resolve it. Let's put it on the ballot this year. So that's our objective and hope in this process. But again, this is another question that we have, because for a referendum, for initiative, you take, as you know, you take it out and you get signatures that are registered voters and to a minimum number. But for a referendum, you have to, first of all, limit those who can gather petitions, gather signatures, to only registered voters in the city. And then number two, every sheet has to be notarized. Well, that's a huge obstacle, as you know, for the citizens of the city to try to meet. And you have 30 days to do it. You don't have 180 days like you do for other signatures like a charter amendment. So 30 days, affidavit, notarized, only registered voters. So frankly, to have gathered over 50,000 signatures in 30 days, at least 30,000 of those over 31 we pre-verified with those standards is pretty amazing. But I think, frankly, we're going to eventually look at challenging that standard and trying to remove that, because that's a burden on the citizens, no matter what the issue. That just simply shouldn't be there, and it's inequitable that you have it for that, not for an initiative. But that's just our view.
And before you take the next question, I'd like to add a few words to that. There's another provision in the city charter regarding a franchise. In year 2000, when the city awarded Metro the power to put rail on city streets, we decided that was a franchise, and under the charter you can challenge that with 500 signatures, but each one has to be notarized. When I was going out with my clipboard, I had to drag along a notary so he can witness every signature.
Goodness gracious. Yes, sir.
Was this equal rights ordinance written from scratch, or was it modifying existing code?
There is an executive. We have city non-discrimination statute for city employees, and of course, and some of those were done by executive order from the mayor, who specifically added the sexual orientation categories to those regards, and for city contracting. So her jurisdiction was limited to just city government. So that's the purpose of this ordinance, was basically to take those and extend them out over the private sector.
What I'm really questioning about that, the reason I read the ordinance several times, and one part of the ordinance that amazes me is the part that talks about if you are an investor and you own more than 3 single-family homes, you are required to retrofit your homes to be for Americans with disabilities, which means light switches and thermostats have to be wheelchair height, bathrooms have to be reinforced with grab bars, and doors have to be 32 inches wide. Was that existing, or is that new with this particular version?
Well, I'm not. First of all, I don't believe that requirement existed to that level in federal law under the American with Disabilities Act. That's what they did. Was part of the whole framework on this was there are federal protections for race, for disability, and for these other areas, but not city protections. And they felt in order to be a world-class city, we have to have those protections. So they've added this whole new layers of city on things like that under the area of housing and employment that don't necessarily conform to the federal law, but some of those protections already exist. All the discrimination protections that we would consider standard already exist, and there are processes for that. And frankly, if they would have only reasserted, which again proves that this wasn't about anything other than the LGBT agenda, if they proposed a city ordinance that added protections in employment and in housing and in public accommodations within certain parameters for the standard categories of race, sex, religion, disability, nobody would have argued with that. That wouldn't even have been a problem. So yes, those are things now. She used those as smoke screens to then put these other things in. And always, and to me, I always assume if somebody's a statist, that means they want government to get bigger. So I always am going to look out in the details, because it always means the government got bigger. So the question is, where was it? How encroaching is it? And how much freedom did we lose on this? And is this something that overall we want it to tolerate? In some cases it may be yes, other cases it's not. And that's our.
A couple, 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to speak on a list of proposed ordinances in the city of Houston here at the and I essentially opposed every one of them and gave my reasons. And partway through the list, one of the members spoke up and said, you know, government is not our enemy. And that stuck with me over the years, because government may not be our enemy, but it is our adversary. And we see that constantly. Anytime the people try to do something that limits governmental activity, I don't care if it's a MUD or federal government, there's always the people within that government that battle to keep the limits from happening. So government is, to some degree, our enemy. I've just gone through a battle with HPAD that will ultimately go to state court or judicial, whatever the jurisdictional vehicle is. And my goal at this point is to take it all the way to trial to force HPAD to disclose a lot of things that they don't want to make public. And we see it every time we turn around. I don't care what layer of government it is. We are constantly at war with our government.
Well, I think the whole concept here of, you know, even if you're talking basic property rights, if you don't, there's certain fundamental freedoms that without those we don't have any freedom. And if you can't own your property and have the right to do with your property within the framework of within the law, with relative freedom, you don't have property rights. Right now, we know we're all renting from the government on a permanent basis through the property tax. But things like the First Amendment, Second Amendment, the things. So I always kind of look at government. You have to have some standard of public policy saying, why are we doing this? What's the why? And is there a compelling government interest to add new law which extends government's reach, which decreases freedom? And that should be asked of every single public policy question. And is that extension of government authority and the decrease of freedom worth the whole losing that much? And and frankly, on this ordinance, we don't think it does. I'm sorry, you're on hand up first there.
You asked for specifics about the Bible. In Genesis, God said to Adam and Eve when he drove them out, he said to Eve, "In pain and suffering thou shalt bear children, and he shall rule over you," depending on the translation, "or you shall obey him." If your wife refuses to obey you, is she violating religious, the Bible's ordinance, what God said? You know, and this business of the government being your adversary, the government is we are in a representative democracy. The government's our friend. And if the government decides that you cannot oppress somebody else, that is not the government, interfering with your action. You want to beat your wife, the government won't let you.
Well, government is necessary. I mean, look, it just is. I mean, nobody reasonably argues that. And saying government's our enemy, obviously, I would go back to Thomas Jefferson saying government's a necessary evil. The fact of the matter is, we live in a world where evil exists. We believe, because evil exists, that means we have to have something that collectively we have as a means to restrain somebody that's going to take the life, the freedom, or the property of somebody else, and that's government. So the only question really is what form of government should that take that maximizes the protection of the innocent and punishes the evildoer with the maximum amount of freedom. And that's what we have in this country. We've been blessed with a constitutional republic that has maximized the freedom. So, but the problem has been that tension is always there. And if we look at the last 200 plus years now, we've seen government grow and grow and grow in a level that our founding fathers would have already risen up over. And which means our freedom is less than it's ever been. And so that's the big question of the day we have on our watch is how far are we going to let government take over the individual acts of our private lives and our families and our property for other reasons. Yes, sir.
One of the things on government, size of government, is that a gentleman who was, I think it was Marx, was writing a set of books. He never wrote the last one because it was supposed to be, how everything works beautifully, because all of his research said that after government gets above a certain size, the society collapses and you go back to the peasant. But the thing is that nobody's ever found a government that didn't get too big. The only question is, do they do it while it causes you problems, or can you put it off on another generation?
Let me just close out with one quick thing, unless there are more questions. But I just want to, first of all, it's pretty, I think, self-explanatory that we're governed by one of two things, either internal restraint or external restraint. And throughout our history, and our founding fathers very clearly leaned toward understanding that we lived in a nation that was governed by self-restraint. John Adams said that there is no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled, in other words, unfettered by religion and morality. So greed, avarice, ambition would break the cords of the Constitution like a whale goes through a net. He said the Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Robert Winthrop, the Speaker of the House in 1830, said this. He said, we will either be governed by the Bible or by the bayonet. And whether it's by the Bible or some other moral code people believe, which happen to think is based on that, fact is, it still comes down to the same thing. That if the people don't act in a moral way that restrains our own behavior to respect the rights of others, something has to restrain us. But the more we reject moral principles, we reject and we accept a free fall and a framework of no moral restraint, no moral principles, then frankly we lose our ability to even define what those are and to protect ourselves from the consequences of not having. How do you say that you can teach your children one thing, that they can have sex with whoever they want, whenever they want, there's no such thing as other than that their own pleasure is one standard, but yet we have a culture that doesn't want the consequences of what happens when that occurs. And we tell children that it's okay to slaughter unborn children for the convenience of any reason at all, but we get upset when a 12-year-old goes out and takes a gun and commits an armed felony. Okay, we have to decide if we're going to have double standards as a society or not, and we think that all bears down to what we're talking about here on these same issues. So I will stand with the founding fathers on these issues: limited government, moral restraint, and a basic moral code that the people live by. And we've got to get back there. Otherwise, if the continued path of where we're going right now, I think we can see the end of our freedom as we know it. But for me and my house, we're going to fight to the end. So, thank you.
I want to comment on Dale's comment. Dennis's comment about the special interest. Because
Get next to the mic.
get to the mic, okay. Well, because government is there as a tool of force that special interests get to manipulate for their purposes. And so government does many good things, but perhaps now the bad things are surpassed because special interests have found ways to manipulate the system. And most of us cannot justify speaking up or interfering because our individual cost is too small. So it's a small cost dispersed among the general population. The benefits will be large and flow into a small handful of people, and that's on many, many issues. And so the elites are actually exploiting each other because they all have different agendas. They're all allowed and free to pursue those agendas and use the power of government to pursue those ends. We're all victimized, including some members of the other elites who are playing the same game. Well, Dave, I want to thank you very much for being available to come today. I think you've given us a much better perspective on what you're dealing with. I think you'll find many people in the room who will support you on this. You expect to be in court? Is that what you think will happen soon?
The city secretary.
Why don't you come back up to the mic?
That's right. The city secretary statutorily has until Monday to announce her report to city council. So we're all waiting to see what that is. Monday we will know, and if they disqualify, declare that we didn't meet the minimum threshold, obviously we'll file an immediate legal challenge, mandamus, challenge that report, and try to put the whole thing on hold, and then move forward to try to prove that we did. If they didn't, obviously, then probably the other side will sue in some capacity, but hopefully we'll end up at the ballot box.
But the deadline council is dealing with is August 18th.
Right.
So you're going to try and get in the court quickly?
Well, the charter mandates that the city council act immediately, so they don't have the latitude of this. Can't be tagged, so the secretary has to report as soon as she's done by the 4th. The council has to act on it immediately, which means the next city council function. Even if the mayor doesn't put it on that agenda, it will be by the next following meeting, which they will have to act on it in that meeting, which will still fit within the 18th. So we're kind of watching that to see too.
And David, council could actually decide that it's a valid petition. They don't have to accept the city secretary's opinion.
That would be an interesting question, because I don't know that that's the case. The city charter specifically says that the city secretary shall report to the city council and whether the signatures have been validated. That is her responsibility, which, by the way, nowhere in the charter does it say city attorney, which is another thing we're challenging, because we trust Anna Russell, we don't trust David Feldman. And so the issue here is that the city secretary is charged with validating, counting not only a number of valid signatures, and then also the legal minimum threshold. And so the second step is required immediate action. So that's right now the city council position of it is at that point is only whether to place it or when to place it on the ballot with the election order. I honestly don't see a role where the city council could validate what she reports as not being valid, but that's something for all the brighter, smarter legal minds to figure out.
Let me take you back to 1992, if my memory is correct, when we had Bob Lanier as mayor. We had a term limits proviso in the charter, but another one that allowed a council member to get signatures to get himself back on the ballot, even though they were term limited. And several council members had flaws in their petition. And the Mayor Lanier decided he would simply tell council that he thought they should all be put on the ballot. He decided, council agreed, and I guess that was legal. Do you have any comment on that phenomenon?
Well, I don't. My only concern would be that, again, I'm going back to the charter here. What I found as we dug into this was very few people around, and most of the guys I knew that were involved in the initiative process were not familiar with the referendum charter provision, because it hadn't been done in years. And there are things about the referendum section of the charter that are different than they are for initiative and they are for anything else. So the only thing I do know that says there is, again, my concern with that would be if the city council could vote to declare it valid if the secretary's report says that not enough were valid. The flip side of that would seem to be logically the case that if she declared that her signatures were validated enough minimum, that they could declare it invalid, which I wouldn't accept. So again, we'll see. That's where the attorneys are going to have to fight that one out.
Another footnote to all this, David, is that right now the mayor is working with another council member, or one of the council members, Bradford, to come up with a new draft for a revised city charter. Now that's going to be a very interesting and controversial document when we get around to that. And the question is, when will that appear? Well, I think we're getting to the close of our, we have another question?
I just wanted to, maybe if I can make a quick announcement.
Yes.
Touching on a lot of the things. My name is John Balkum. I'm the president of the Houston Young Republicans. And one of our members...
A group of what group?
The Houston Young Republicans.
Why don't you come up here to the microphone? We've got 1 minute. Go ahead.
And so one of our members, Carl Jarvis, he's a Navy veteran.
Start over.
Okay. John Balkum, president of the Houston Young Republicans. A member of ours, Carl Jarvis, he's a Navy veteran, constitutional scholar, recently wrote this book, The United States of Dysfunction. Touches on a lot of the things we were talking about here at the end of the meeting, the systematic breakdown of our constitutional Republican form of government. So it goes into the history of sort of the breakdown, especially over the last 100 years, of the unaccountability of the government to we the people. And then he also offers some solutions how you can get involved, different ways interacting with the political parties outside of just the standard protest and the generic sort of voting. So
week when we'll have Lauren Barsh here. She was scheduled to be our speaker initially. Hopefully she'll be well enough to come back and tell us about her thoughts and where the city's ordinance should be changed to accommodate the new app phenomenon of dispatching taxis. She is not entirely in agreement with some of those proposed changes. She actually has the jitney service on Washington Avenue. We'll hear about that next Friday. Thank you very much.
One more thing, if anyone wants to follow updates on this, the website.
I wonder why it chose to be 45.
I see Barry all the time.
We have a breakfast tomorrow also. Denny's at 9.
Like you said, just his expertise to sort of share. I was talking about, you need a tool to be successful. That kind of person. I'm more impressed with the book or with the author?
Also been part of the and this committee will
Good. I saw Barry last night. After I left y'all, I went to Milton birthday party.
I'll give you 2 copies.
I do. This is a group, another group,